I found the secret bank statements while searching for aspirin in his desk drawer. 6 accounts I'd never seen before, $87,000 in debt, all in my name. As I stared at the papers, my phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa, my best friend since college. Running late, meeting Eric for coffee first, wedding plans later. Little did I know, my husband and my maid of honor weren't discussing our anniversary party at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The September sun filtered through the kitchen windows of our Victorian-style home in Oak Ridge, casting golden rectangles across the marble countertops I'd insisted were worth the splurge when we renovated last year. I hummed along to Fleetwood Mac as I arranged cinnamon rolls in a perfect spiral, Eric's favorite breakfast on his birthday. "Something smells amazing," Eric said, wrapping his arms around my waist from behind. At 42, my husband of 15 years still had the same boyish smile that had made me drop my psychology textbooks when we collided outside the university library. His dark hair was now threaded with distinguished silver at the temples, and the crinkles around his eyes had deepened with time, but his entrepreneur's confidence had only grown stronger with each passing year. "Happy birthday," I replied, turning to kiss him. 45 looks good on you." Eric Morgan, founder of Horizon Financial Advisors, had built his boutique investment firm from a one-man operation in our garage to a downtown office with 12 employees. His success story was featured in business magazines, and our social circle was populated with clients who had become friends. I'd put my own career as a child psychologist on part-time status to support his dreams, believing we were building something together. "Can't stay for breakfast," Eric said, grabbing a travel mug. "Emergency client meeting. Possibly a big fish from Seattle. Might need to drive up there later." He kissed my forehead. "Rain check on the celebration? I promise I'll make it up to you this weekend." I nodded, swallowing disappointment. This had become our routine. His business always taking precedence, my understanding always expected. But ours was a partnership, I reminded myself. His success was our success. "I'm seeing Vanessa at noon to finalize details for our anniversary party," I said, wrapping a cinnamon roll in foil and pressing it into his hand. "At least eat this on the way. You two have fun planning. Just keep it small, okay? Nothing extravagant." He winked. "The market's been volatile lately." I watched his BMW back down our driveway, thinking about our upcoming 15th anniversary celebration. Vanessa Henderson had been excited to help plan it, almost suspiciously so. As my best friend since our college roommate days and my maid of honor at our wedding, she knew every chapter of our love story. Recently divorced herself, she joked that planning my celebration was her vicarious romance fix. The house felt emptier than usual after Eric left. Our daughter Zoe was in her first semester at UCLA, fulfilling her dream of studying film production. At 18, she was our only child, a miracle baby after years of trying. The nest had been empty for barely a month, and I was still adjusting to the silence. I wandered into Eric's home office to retrieve our shared calendar, wondering if I'd overlooked other appointments he might have scheduled. The migraine that had been threatening since morning finally seized behind my right eye, and I opened his desk drawer looking for aspirin. What I found instead were bank statements. Tucked beneath a folder labeled Tax Documents 2023 were 6. Monthly statements from banks I'd never heard of, all addressed to Eric Morgan or Eric and Julia Morgan. Credit cards, personal loans, and lines of credit totaling $87,000, all opened within the last 8 months. My first thought was identity theft. We were comfortable financially, but not extravagant. Eric managed our investments while I handled our household budget through our long-standing joint account at First National. These statements made no sense, especially since they were all in arrears, some showing missed payments for 3 consecutive months. My phone buzzed with Vanessa's text about meeting Eric for coffee before our lunch. Nothing unusual about that. They'd known each other as long as I'd known either of them. Yet something about the casual message sent a ripple of unease through me. I set the statements aside, determined to ask Eric about them that evening. Perhaps there was a reasonable explanation. Business expansion costs or investment opportunities he hadn't gotten around to discussing with me. As I closed the drawer, I spotted a small black case partially hidden behind a row of financial books. Curiosity overrode my usual respect for Eric's privacy. Inside was a sleek silver recorder, the kind lawyers use for depositions. I pressed play. The Scottsdale property should bring around $1.2 million if we list in March, Eric's voice emerged, followed by a woman's laugh. More than enough for our fresh start, said the female voice, unmistakably Vanessa's. But are you sure about the timing? Julia's been asking questions about the credit card statements. She only sees what I want her to see, Eric replied dismissively. Besides, she's too busy planning that ridiculous anniversary party. By the time she realizes anything's wrong, we'll be setting up our new life in Arizona. I played the recording 3 times, the world tilting around me. The timestamp showed it was from just 1 week ago. My finger hovered over the delete button, momentarily tempted to erase what I'd heard and retreat into blissful ignorance. Instead, I slipped the recorder into my pocket. The rest of the morning passed in a haze. I canceled lunch with Vanessa, claiming a migraine that was now genuinely pounding behind my eyes. I wandered through our home, touching the family photos on the walls, the handmade pottery from our trip to Greece, the antique reading chair Eric had surprised me with on my 40th birthday, 15 years of marriage, a beautiful daughter, a life I thought was built on mutual respect and shared dreams. Had it all been a carefully constructed illusion? I sat in our sunny kitchen surrounded by birthday cinnamon rolls that would go uneaten, trying to reconcile. The man I married with the voice on the recorder. The financial advisor trusted by dozens of clients. The father who cried when he dropped his daughter at college last month. The husband who still brought me coffee in bed every Sunday morning. My phone rang, Eric's mother calling to coordinate his surprise birthday dinner for the weekend. I answered with practiced normalcy, promising to bring his favorite bourbon, pecan pie. In that moment, I made a decision. Whatever was happening, whoever Eric had become, I would not be blindsided again. I retrieved our old digital recorder from the drawer of outdated electronics, the one we'd used to record Zoe's first words, the one that had subsequently been relegated to obscurity in the age of smartphones. It still worked. If Eric and Vanessa were recording their plans, I would start recording too. Not just conversations, but evidence, documentation, truth. The secure world I thought I inhabited had just revealed its false floor, but I wouldn't fall through without a parachute. The next morning, I woke to an empty bed and a text from Eric. Early client meeting. Don't wait up tonight. Dinner with the Seattle investors. I stared at the phone, wondering how many of these client meetings had actually been rendezvous with Vanessa. The thought of them laughing over my obliviousness made my stomach churn. I called the office directly, something I rarely did. Eric's assistant Megan answered with her usual efficiency. Julia, what a nice surprise. Did you need to speak with Eric? Actually, I was hoping to drop by and take him to lunch for his birthday. Is he in meetings all morning? I kept my voice casual. Maternal instincts from years of counseling children helping me maintain the facade. A pause. Eric isn't in today. He took a personal day. Said something about preparing for the Seattle trip tomorrow. Megan sounded genuinely confused. I thought you two might be doing something special. Of course, I recovered quickly. He wanted to keep it a surprise, but I guess the secret's out. Thanks, Megan. The first lie confirmed, I moved methodically. I dressed for work, drove to my practice, and saw my 3 scheduled young patients with the focused attention they deserved. Between sessions, I called our bank and requested immediate access to our complete financial records. Mrs. Morgan, there appears to be a restriction on your account, the bank representative said, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Your husband has requested that all statements be sent electronically to his email only. Since when? I asked, gripping the phone tighter. This change was made approximately 7 months ago. There's a note here that you were switching to paperless for environmental reasons. Another lie. I'd never discussed such a change. I need to see all transactions for the past year, I insisted. This is my joint account, and I have every right to this information. After verifying my identity and enduring a supervisor consultation, the bank agreed to send the records to my personal email. The attachment arrived while I was helping 8-year-old Tyler work through his anxiety about his parents' divorce. An irony not lost on me. During my lunch break, I opened the statement and felt the floor drop beneath me again. Regular transfers, $5,000 to $10,000 at a time, had been leaving our joint savings account for months, channeled into one of the accounts I'd discovered yesterday. Our retirement fund, which had contained nearly $320,000 the last time I'd checked, was down to less than $85,000. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the transactions. Credit card payments to accounts I didn't recognize. Wire transfers to an entity called Saguaro Holdings LLC. Cashier's checks in large amounts. Our financial life was hemorrhaging, and I hadn't noticed the bleeding because Eric had deliberately kept me in the dark. I canceled my afternoon appointments, citing a family emergency that was becoming increasingly real by the minute. On the drive home, Vanessa called. I let it go to voicemail, not trusting myself to maintain the pretense of friendship. Hey, Jules. Just checking in since you canceled yesterday. Hope that migraine is better. Eric mentioned you weren't feeling well when I saw him for coffee. Let's reschedule soon. I have some exciting ideas for the anniversary party. The casual deception in her voice, my best friend of 20 years, triggered something primal. I pulled into a grocery store parking lot and screamed until my throat burned, beating my hands against the steering wheel until pain forced me to stop. When I finally arrived home, the house felt like a stage set. Beautiful, but hollow. I went straight to Eric's office and began a systematic search. The recorder was my constant companion, documenting the evidence as I uncovered it. Behind the financial planning books, I've found what appears to be property information for a luxury condominium in Scottsdale, I narrated, photographing the documents with my phone. Purchase price, $1.4 million. Buyer, Saguaro Holdings LLC. In his email, password protected, but he'd used Zoe's birthday for years, I discovered correspondence with an Arizona-based real estate attorney. Eric and Vanessa had created an LLC together 6 months ago. They had been planning this for half a year, methodically extracting our assets while maintaining the charade of normal life. Most devastating was a draft letter to our daughter, saved but never sent. Zoe, by the time you read this, I'll have started a new chapter. Your mother and I have grown apart over the years, though we've tried to shield you from that reality. I'll always be your father, but I need to pursue my own happiness now. Vanessa makes me happy in ways I haven't felt in years. I hope someday you'll understand and welcome her into your life as I have. I recorded myself reading it aloud, my voice breaking on the final sentences. The methodical dismantling of our life together was so calculated it felt sociopathic. The man I had built a life with, raised a child with, supported through career, changes and midlife crises, this man had been planning to leave me financially devastated while running off with my closest friend. As I cataloged each betrayal, a numb efficiency replaced my initial shock. The child psychologist in me recognized the stages of grief accelerating through my system, denial giving way to anger, bargaining briefly with fantasies of confrontation and reconciliation, before settling into a depression so heavy it felt physical. When the doorbell rang at 4:30, I was surrounded by piles of evidence, having uncovered 3 more credit accounts in my name that I'd never authorized. I quickly gathered everything into a banker's box and hid it in the closet before answering. On my doorstep stood Chase Bennett, a financial investigator I'd met years ago when he was seeking counseling for his son. "Julia," he said, looking uncomfortable in his formal suit. "I need to speak with you about some irregularities involving Horizon Financial. Is Eric home?" "No," I replied, my professional composure slipping. "But I think I've discovered some irregularities of my own today. You'd better come in." Chase explained that 3 clients had filed complaints about missing funds from their investment accounts. The regulatory authorities were investigating, and Eric's firm was under scrutiny. The timing of these withdrawals coincides with large deposits into a private account, Chase said carefully. "I shouldn't be telling you this, but given our history, Julia, there's evidence suggesting Eric has been misappropriating client funds." The final piece clicked into place. The debt in my name wasn't from lavish spending. It was designed to be his escape hatch, a way to extract more money while leaving me to deal with the consequences of his financial crimes. "He's planning to leave," I said flatly, "with my best friend, to Arizona." Chase's expression confirmed he wasn't entirely surprised. "Julia, if what you're saying is true, this goes beyond a domestic issue. We're talking about wire fraud, possible embezzlement, identity theft if those accounts in your name were opened without authorization." As Chase left, promising to return tomorrow with the proper authorities, I stood in the doorway of the home I might soon lose, watching the autumn leaves skitter across our perfectly manicured lawn. The carefully tended life I thought I had was being stripped bare, revealing rot at its foundation. I called my daughter. "Mom," Zoe answered, her voice bright with the enthusiasm of new college experiences. "I was just about to call you. I got the lead in the student film I auditioned for." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I managed, protecting her from my reality for just a little longer. "I'm so proud of you." That night, I couldn't sleep. The bed felt enormous without Eric beside me, though now I wondered how many nights he'd actually been with Vanessa while claiming to work late. I pulled out the recorder and spoke into it, organizing my thoughts. October 3rd, 2:17 a.m. I'm creating this record for my own protection and potential legal proceedings. Today, I discovered that my husband, Eric Morgan, and my friend Vanessa Henderson appear to be involved in both a personal relationship and financial conspiracy that involves. I documented everything methodically: the hidden accounts, the unauthorized credit cards, the drained retirement fund, the Arizona property, and now the potential misappropriation of client funds. Speaking the facts aloud gave me a fragile sense of control. At 3:40 a.m., my phone lit up with a text from Vanessa. "Just checking you're okay. Eric mentioned you've been acting strangely. Let's grab coffee tomorrow, just us girls. I'm worried about you." The audacity stole my breath. I took a screenshot of the message, saving it to my growing evidence file without responding. How long had they been discussing me as if I were the problem? How many conversations had they shared about my obliviousness? Morning arrived with cruel brightness. I called in sick to work for the first time in 5 years and made an appointment with Diane Levitt, a divorce attorney whose name I remembered from a colleague's bitter separation last year. She agreed to see me immediately when I mentioned possible financial fraud. Before leaving, I searched for our most important documents: birth certificates, property deeds, insurance policies. The fireproof box where we kept them was in Eric's closet, hidden behind a row of expensive suits. When I opened it, I discovered it was nearly empty. Our house deed, insurance policies, and even Zoe's birth certificate were gone. Only my passport and social security card remained, apparently deemed unimportant to his escape plan. "He's taken all our essential documents," I recorded, photographing the nearly empty box. "This further supports my belief that his departure is imminent." Diane Levitt's office was in a converted Victorian downtown, the kind of place that exuded both warmth and professional competence. The attorney herself was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who listened without interruption as I laid out the situation, spreading my evidence across her desk. "First things first," she said when I finished. "We need to freeze your credit immediately. If he's been opening accounts in your name, he could do more damage before he leaves." She helped me make the calls right from her office, placing fraud alerts with all 3 credit bureaus. Then she outlined my options with brutal clarity. "Based on what you've shown me, you're dealing with 3 separate issues: the divorce itself, the identity theft and financial fraud against you personally, and potentially being implicated in his professional misconduct if he's misappropriated client funds." "Implicated?" I echoed. But I knew nothing about this. "Ignorance isn't always protection in these cases," Diane said gently, "particularly if your name is on any business documents or if you've benefited from the proceeds. Have you signed anything for his business recently? Tax returns? Loan applications?" My mind raced back to the stack of papers Eric had asked me to sign 2 months ago. "Just annual business formalities," he'd said, as I signed without reading while preparing dinner. "Oh, God," I whispered. "We'll need copies of everything you signed," Diane said, making notes. "And Julia, given the circumstances, I have to ask, do you have somewhere safe you can stay? When financial criminals realize they're about to be caught, they sometimes become dangerous." The suggestion that Eric, who had once held my hand through 22 hours of labor, who teared up at sappy commercials, might physically harm me seemed absurd. But then, I would have said the same about him stealing my identity or planning to abandon me. "I'll be fine at home," I said, not entirely convinced. "He doesn't know that I know." "Keep it that way," Diane advised. "Continue as normally as possible while we gather evidence." The recorder was good thinking. Arizona is a one-party consent state for recordings, so anything you document there would be admissible if they relocate as planned. As I left Diane's office, Chase Bennett called. The regulatory investigation was accelerating. 3 more clients had come forward reporting missing funds, totaling nearly $2.1 million. "Julia, they're planning to execute a search warrant at Horizon's offices tomorrow morning. Eric will be taken in for questioning. I wanted you to hear it from me first." The timeline suddenly compressed. If Eric was about to be questioned by authorities, he might accelerate his departure plans. I thanked Chase and immediately called Diane to update her. "Go home and secure any remaining financial documents or valuables," she instructed. "If he hasn't already hidden them, he will, once he knows about the investigation." At home, I began a systematic inventory of our valuables. My grandmother's jewelry was missing from its velvet box. The rare coin collection Eric had inherited from his father, gone. Even the emergency cash we kept in the false bottom of our closet safe had vanished. As I documented each missing item, my phone buzzed with a calendar notification. Anniversary. Party planning. Vanessa's house. 5:30 p.m. The reminder of the celebration we'd never have triggered a laugh that sounded alarmingly close to a sob, even to my own ears. On impulse, I decided to go to the meeting, to sit across from my husband's lover, my supposed best friend, and see if I could detect any hint of remorse in her eyes. The psychologist in me needed to understand how someone could maintain such an elaborate deception. I freshened my makeup, covering the shadows under my eyes, and drove to Vanessa's upscale townhouse. Her red Audi was in the driveway, but when I rang the bell, no one answered. I was about to leave when I noticed the back gate was ajar. Vanessa's voice drifted from her patio, tense and urgent. "Need to move up the timeline. It's all falling apart at the office." Eric's reply was equally strained. "We can't just disappear overnight. Julia's already suspicious, and there's Zoe to consider." "Zoe is an adult who will eventually understand," Vanessa said dismissively. "And Julia is so wrapped up in her patient's problems, she can barely see what's in front of her. Besides, by the time she figures it out, we'll be established in Scottsdale with new identities. The documents are nearly ready." New identities. The words hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just an affair or financial misconduct. They were planning to completely disappear. I slipped my phone from my pocket and activated the recording app, carefully positioning myself where I could capture their conversation without being seen. "What about the client's money?" Vanessa asked. "Will they be able to trace it to us?" "The Cayman account is untraceable," Eric replied, "and Julia's name is on enough paperwork that she'll be their primary target once we're gone. By the time she convinces them she knew nothing, we'll be living comfortably under different names." The calculated cruelty, not just abandoning me, but deliberately setting me up to take the fall for his crimes, stole the breath from my lungs. I must have made a sound because both of them suddenly fell silent. "Did you hear something?" Eric asked. I retreated quickly, making it to my car just as Vanessa's back door opened. As I drove away, a single thought crystallized with perfect clarity. The man I had loved for 15 years had become a stranger who was willing to destroy me, to save himself. The next morning, I awoke to hammering on the front door. 3 police officers and a federal agent stood on my porch, their faces grim with official purpose. "Mrs. Morgan? We have a warrant to search these premises in connection with an investigation into Horizon Financial Advisors," the agent said, handing me a document I could barely focus on. "Is your husband home?" "No," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "He didn't come home last night." They exchanged glances that confirmed my suspicion. Eric had already fled. As they began methodically searching our home, I sat at the kitchen island clutching a cold cup of coffee, watching strangers dismantle what remained of my life. "Mrs. Morgan," said a female detective, approaching with surprising gentleness, "we need to ask you some questions about your involvement with Horizon Financial." For the next 2 hours, I answered the same questions repeatedly. Did I have access to the company accounts? What did I know about client investments? When had I last signed business documents? Was I aware of any offshore accounts? "I'm a child." "Psychologist," I finally said, exhaustion breaking through my composure. "I counsel children through trauma and family transitions. I don't know about investment accounts or offshore banking. My husband handled all of that. And yet your signature appears on several documents authorizing fund transfers," the agent said, sliding papers across the table. "Including this one, dated just last month, moving $450,000 from the Peterson family's retirement account to a holding company in Grand Cayman." I stared at the signature. It looked like mine, but with subtle differences, the same discrepancies I'd noticed on the credit card applications. "That's not my signature," I said firmly. "He's been forging my name for months. I have evidence." I reached for my phone to show them the recordings and photographs I'd been collecting, only to realize it was missing. In my rush to leave Vanessa's house undetected, I must have dropped it near her patio. "I can prove I knew nothing about this," I insisted. "I have recordings of my husband and Vanessa Henderson discussing their plans to frame me and flee with new identities." The skepticism on their faces was palpable. Without my phone and the digital evidence I'd gathered, my claims sounded like desperate excuses. After they left, promising to return with more questions, I tried logging into my cloud account to retrieve backups of the recordings. My password had been changed. My email showed the same. Access denied. Somehow, Eric had locked me out of my own digital life. I called Diane from our landline, the only communication method I had left. "They've been here," I said without preamble. "Eric's gone, and I've lost my phone with all the evidence. He's locked me out of my accounts." "I've been trying to reach you," Diane replied urgently. "Your bank accounts have been emptied overnight. All of them. And there's more. Chase Bennett called me when he couldn't reach you. Eric and Vanessa didn't show up for questioning this morning. Their passports were scanned at the San Diego airport at 5:15 a.m. on a flight to Mexico." The room seemed to tilt. "They're gone? Already?" "It appears so." "Julia, I need you to come to my office immediately. The FBI wants to interview you as a person of interest. Person of interest. The euphemism barely disguised the reality. I was a suspect in my husband's crimes. On the drive to Diane's office, I passed the building that housed Horizon Financial. Police tape blocked the entrance, and clients, people I'd shared dinners and holidays with, stood outside looking shell-shocked and angry. One woman, Margaret Peterson, whose children I'd occasionally counseled pro bono, spotted me driving past. Her expression transformed from confusion to fury as she pointed at my car, shouting something I couldn't hear. Word was spreading. I was already being cast as either complicit or catastrophically naive. At Diane's office, the federal agents were more direct than they'd been in my home. Their investigation had revealed that over $4.8 million in client funds had disappeared over the past 8 months. My name was on numerous documents, and without evidence of coercion or forgery, I was facing potential charges as an accessory. "We've frozen all remaining assets connected to you and your husband," the lead agent informed me. "Your accounts, property, vehicles, everything is subject to the investigation." "What am I supposed to live on?" I asked, the practical reality of my situation finally hitting home. "That's not our primary concern at this moment," he replied coldly. After they left, promising yet more questions, Diane outlined my deteriorating position with brutal clarity. I had no access to funds. The mortgage and equity line on our house were both in arrears, with foreclosure likely within weeks. The credit cards in my name, legitimate and fraudulent, were maxed out and unpaid. My practice would suffer once news of the investigation spread. "And Zoe's tuition?" I asked, thinking of my daughter who still knew nothing of our disintegrating family. "I'm afraid those funds were among those withdrawn," Diane confirmed softly. "UCLA will be notified about the federal hold on all family assets." I drove home in a fog of disbelief. The beautiful house Eric and I had renovated just last year, the home where we'd raised our daughter, now felt like a mausoleum to my failed judgment. That evening, as I sat alone in our kitchen surrounded by the aftermath of the police search, my landline rang. It was Zoe. "Mom?" Her voice was small and confused. "Why is the FBI asking to interview me about Dad? And why aren't you answering your cell? What's going on?" I closed my eyes, gathering strength for the conversation I'd been dreading. "Sweetheart, there's something I need to tell you. It's about Dad and some very bad decisions he's made. Telling my daughter that her father had stolen millions, run off with my best friend, emptied her college fund, and potentially implicated me in his crimes was the most painful conversation of my life." Her shocked silence gave way to disbelief, then anger, then tears, mirroring my own emotional journey of the past few days. "I'm coming home," she declared. "No," I said firmly. "You need to stay there and focus on your studies. I'll figure this out." "How? They've taken everything!" Zoe cried. "My roommate's parents are lawyers. They said you could go to prison if they think you helped him." After reassuring Zoe as best I could, I wandered through our empty house, mentally cataloging everything that could be sold quickly. My wedding ring, the antique desk that had been my splurge when my practice first became profitable, the art we'd collected over the years. Even if I sold everything of value, it wouldn't begin to address the mountain of debt Eric had left behind, let alone provide legal fees or living expenses. As I passed his office, now in disarray from the police search, something caught my eye. A slight gap in the wooden paneling below the window seat. Eric had installed the custom storage himself last year, insisting on doing the work without contractors. Kneeling down, I pressed against the panel. It swung open silently, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a fireproof pouch containing a passport I'd never seen before, in Eric's photo but under the name Daniel Edwards, along with $15,000 in cash and a small notebook filled with account numbers, passwords, and what appeared to be a coded system for accessing hidden funds. With shaking hands, I examined the currency. Crisp hundreds, sequential serial numbers, the kind of cash one might get directly from a bank for a large withdrawal. The kind that might have come from his client's accounts. In that moment, kneeling on the floor of my ransacked home, holding physical evidence of my husband's calculated betrayal and escape plan, I finally hit true bottom. Every belief I'd held about my marriage, my friend, my financial security, and my future had been systematically destroyed. I had lost my home, my savings, my reputation, and potentially my freedom. My daughter's education hung in jeopardy. Former friends now viewed me with suspicion or outright hostility. I was isolated, implicated, and drowning in debt I hadn't created. The temptation to use the cash, to flee myself, to secure a lawyer, to save something from the wreckage, whispered seductively. But that path would only confirm the suspicions against me. Instead, I reached for the landline and dialed Chase Bennett's number. "I've found something," I said when he answered. Something? Eric left behind. Chase arrived within 30 minutes, bringing with him a female FBI agent named Teresa Vasquez. She bagged the passport, cash, and notebook as evidence, her expression shifting from professional suspicion to cautious reassessment as she examined the hidden compartment. "Why didn't you just keep this?" she asked bluntly, securing the evidence. "Bags. You could have used the cash to hire a better attorney, or at least keep your lights on while this plays out." "Because I'm not him," I replied simply. "And because using that money would make me exactly what everyone already thinks I am, complicit." Something in my words or tone must have resonated with her. Agent Vasquez's formal demeanor softened slightly as she handed me her card. "If you find anything else, call me directly," she said. "And Mrs. Morgan? The fact that you turned this in voluntarily will be noted in my report." After they left, I sat in the darkening house, unable to summon the energy to turn on lights. My phone service was disconnected, my accounts frozen, and tomorrow I would need to face my patient's parents and explain why I couldn't continue their children's therapy. The weight of it all pressed down like a physical force. The doorbell rang at 9:45 p.m. I considered ignoring it, but the persistent visitor began knocking loudly. Through the peephole, I saw a slender woman with short gray hair and an armful of file folders. "Mrs. Morgan? I'm Elaine Hutchins. I need to speak with you about Horizon Financial." Great. Another angry client. I opened the door, too exhausted to hide anymore. "I have nothing left to give you," I said wearily. "Whatever my husband promised. Whatever he took, I knew nothing about it. But you'll have to get in line with everyone else seeking restitution." Elaine Hutchins didn't react with the anger I expected. Instead, she pushed past me into the foyer, setting her files on the console table with practiced efficiency. "I'm not a client," she clarified, her voice crisp. "I was Eric's assistant at Horizon for the first 8 years. Before Megan, he fired me when I questioned some irregularities in the Peterson account." I stared at her, uncomprehending. "Eric told me you left to care for your mother in Florida." "Another convenient lie," she said, arranging her files in meticulous order. "Your husband has been siphoning small amounts from client accounts since the beginning." I noticed the pattern and confronted him. He terminated me with a generous severance package contingent on a non-disclosure agreement. "Why are you telling me this now? And why come to me instead of the authorities?" Elaine finally looked up, her eyes sharp behind stylish glasses. "Because I've been keeping records for 3 years. When I saw the news about Horizon, I knew it was time. And I'm coming to you because I think you're being set up to take the fall." For the next hour, Elaine walked me through her meticulously documented evidence, spreadsheets showing systematic withdrawals disguised as management fees, copies of altered client statements, notes from conversations where Eric had asked her to process irregular transactions. Most damning were the signature comparison documents she'd compiled, clearly showing how Eric had progressed from simple forgery to highly sophisticated replication of my handwriting. He was laying the groundwork for this for years, Elaine explained, spreading out timeline charts across my dining room table. The pattern suggests he was always planning an exit strategy where you would appear complicit. Why would you risk your severance by keeping these records? I asked. The NDA becomes void in cases of criminal activity. She completed my sentence. Besides, I worked with you on those charity events for foster children. I saw how you insisted Horizon donate services to families in crisis. I never believed you were part of his schemes. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. Elaine's records provided the verification my claims had lacked. Still, a lifetime of professional skepticism made me cautious. Why didn't you go to the authorities sooner? Elaine sighed, removing her glasses to rub the bridge of her nose. Fear, primarily. Eric made veiled threats about my mother's care facility, implied he had connections who could make her life difficult. Then when things settled and I was established elsewhere, it was easier to stay silent. She straightened, regret etching lines around her mouth. I'm not proud of that choice, but seeing your face on the news, hearing them describe you as a person of interest, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I studied her expression, my years of psychological training allowing me to recognize genuine remorse. We need to take this to Agent Vasquez immediately. There's more, Elaine said hesitantly. Your friend Vanessa has been involved longer than you think. I have records of her visiting the office frequently when you were seeing patients, helping Eric create the LLC, structures used to hide assets. The betrayal cut deeper still. Vanessa hadn't just run off with my husband. She'd been an architect of my destruction for years. How did I not see any of this? I whispered, more to myself than to Elaine. Because you trusted them, she answered, simply. And they exploited that trust systematically. That's what predators do. The word predators jolted me. In my practice, I'd counseled children who'd been manipulated by trusted adults, teachers, coaches, family friends. I'd taught them that the manipulation wasn't their fault, that skilled predators choose victims who are trusting and loyal. Now I found myself in the same position as my young patients, betrayed by those I trusted most, questioning how I could have been so blind. We should contact the FBI tonight, Elaine urged, gathering her files. Every hour matters when they might be establishing new identities abroad. I called Agent Vasquez using Elaine's phone. The agent agreed to meet us at the local FBI field office immediately. As we prepared to leave, I noticed Elaine studying a family photo on the wall. Eric, Zoe, and me at her high school graduation last year, all of us beaming with pride and apparent happiness. He really had everyone fooled, she commented. Myself included for a long time. Not everyone, I corrected, thinking of the hidden passport, the secret accounts. Someone else knew what he was, and I think I need to find them. The FBI office hummed with late-night activity when we arrived. Agent Vasquez escorted us to a conference room where Chase Bennett was already waiting with another agent. For nearly 3 hours, Elaine methodically presented her evidence, answering technical questions about Horizon's operations and Eric's manipulation of client accounts. I watched the agent's expressions shift from skepticism to focused interest. When Elaine produced copies of my allegedly signed documents alongside examples of Eric practicing my signature, Agent Vasquez leaned forward, suddenly alert. These forgeries are sophisticated, she said, examining the progression. He was clearly planning this for years. Which is why I didn't notice, I added quietly. The differences are subtle enough that I might have assumed I'd signed something, in a hurry. For the first time, I saw real belief in their eyes, the recognition that I might genuinely be another victim rather than a co-conspirator. As dawn approached, Agent Vasquez walked us out, her professional demeanor intact but somehow less adversarial. Mrs. Morgan, these documents change the direction of our investigation substantially. We'll need formal statements from both of you, but for now— She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Your status in this case is evolving. Meaning I'm not a suspect anymore? I asked directly. Meaning the evidence now suggests you may indeed be another victim of your husband's crimes. She handed me another card. This is the victim's services coordinator for financial crimes. They may be able to help with immediate needs while your assets remain frozen. It wasn't freedom or restitution, but it was acknowledgement, the first official indication that I might eventually clear my name. In the parking lot, Elaine turned to me with unexpected intensity. Julia, there's someone else you should talk to. Claudia Reeves. She was Eric's girlfriend before you, worked at the investment firm where he started. He left her suddenly, right when there was an internal audit. Sound familiar? You think he's done this before, I said slowly, the implications sinking in. Elaine nodded grimly. I think Eric Morgan has a pattern. And if we're going to stop him from doing this again, we need to understand exactly how he operates. As the sun rose over the city, casting long shadows across the parking lot, I realized I had gained something. Precious amid all I had lost. An ally who believed me. And perhaps the first thread that might unravel the elaborate tapestry of lies Eric had woven around our lives. Claudia Reeves lived in a modest townhouse on the other side of the city. When Elaine and I arrived at her doorstep later that morning, I felt like an archaeologist excavating the ruins of my husband's past. The woman who answered our knock was perhaps 50, with intelligent eyes and a wary expression that softened when Elaine introduced us. So he finally did it to someone else, Claudia said, ushering us into a sunlit living room filled with plants and art. No photographs were visible. I've been waiting for this visit for almost 16 years. The parallels between our stories emerged over strong coffee. Claudia had been an investment analyst at Meridian Capital when she met Eric, then known as Richard Evans. Their 2-year relationship ended when Richard vanished after being questioned about discrepancies in client accounts. He left behind falsified documents with Claudia's signature, draining their joint savings and leaving her to face both professional scrutiny and personal bankruptcy. They couldn't prove I was involved, but my reputation was destroyed, Claudia explained, her calm voice belying the devastating impact. No financial firm would touch me after that. I rebuilt my life teaching mathematics at the community college. How did you survive it? I asked, desperate to see a path through my own crisis. Claudia gestured around her plant-filled home. I started over completely. Sold everything I couldn't carry, changed my name legally to make it harder for Richard, or Eric, as you know him, to find me if he ever tried to circle back. Moved across the country, built something new on my own terms. The idea of completely reinventing myself was simultaneously terrifying and compelling. Everything that had defined my identity, wife, homeowner, respected professional, had been compromised or taken. Perhaps a blank slate was the only way forward. Did you ever try to track him down? To clear your name? I asked. For the first year, that was all I thought about, Claudia admitted. I was obsessed with exposing him, forcing him to face consequences. But eventually I realized that obsession was another way he controlled me, even in absence. She leaned forward, her gaze intensifying. The real victory wasn't in punishing him, it was in freeing myself from the narrative he created. While her philosophy was admirable, my situation was more urgent. With criminal investigations underway and my professional reputation in tatters, I couldn't simply walk away and start fresh. I needed to clear my name for Zoe's sake, if nothing else. As we were leaving, Claudia handed me a small leather journal. I kept records of everything I remembered after he left. Patterns, behaviors, inconsistencies in his stories. It helped me put the pieces together later. Take it. Maybe you'll find something investigators missed. Back at my house, which the bank had informed me was scheduled for foreclosure proceedings in 20 days, Elaine and I created a command center at my dining room table. We spread out Claudia's journal, Elaine's financial records, and my own notes. searching for patterns that might help authorities track Eric and Vanessa. He always had a secondary phone, I remembered, scanning Claudia's journal entries. Said it was for international clients in different time zones. And the watch collecting, Elaine added. High-end timepieces that hold value and are easy to transport. We worked through the afternoon, creating a detailed profile of Eric's methodologies and potential hideouts. By evening, we had compiled information on 5 properties across 3 countries connected to shell companies Elaine had documented. I called Agent Vasquez using Elaine's phone, passing along our findings. This is useful, she acknowledged. We've got alerts at border crossings and financial institutions, but your insights into his contingency planning could help narrow the search. After she hung up, I faced the immediate crisis of my circumstances. The refrigerator contained 2 yogurts and half a loaf of bread. The electricity was scheduled to be disconnected in 3 days. My car would likely be repossessed by the end of the week. You can't stay here, Elaine stated flatly, reading my thoughts. You need a place to regroup while this plays out. I have nowhere to go, I admitted. Most of our friends were actually Eric's clients. The few who might have helped, well, they've seen the news. Elaine studied me with the same efficiency she brought to financial records. I have a spare room. It's nothing fancy, but it's yours if you want it. The offer stunned me. Why would you do that? You barely know me. I watched Eric manipulate people for 8 years, she replied simply. I did nothing then. I can do something now. That night, I packed 2 suitcases with clothes and essential personal items. As I moved through the house, selecting family photos, Zoe's childhood art, my most treasured books, I felt like a ghost, gathering remnants of a life that no longer existed. In Zoe's empty bedroom, I sat on her bed clutching the stuffed rabbit she'd loved as a child but had been too cool to pack for college. How would I explain to my daughter that we'd lost our home, that her childhood bedroom would soon belong to strangers, that her father was not just gone, but had betrayed us in ways that might permanently alter our futures? My phone rang, a temporary, prepaid model Elaine had purchased so I could communicate with Zoe and authorities. It was Diane Levitt. I've got some developments, she said without preamble. First, I filed emergency motions to separate your financial identity from Eric's for purposes of the investigation. Second, the handwriting analysis on those documents Elaine provided is working in your favor. The expert confirms they're sophisticated forgeries. That's something, at least, I said, relief tempering my exhaustion. There's more, Diane continued. A former client of mine works for the university's legal department. She believes she can help make a case for Zoe to retain her scholarship despite the financial holds. It would require documenting that she's estranged from her father and that you're a victim, not an accomplice. A small lifeline for Zoe. I closed, my eyes in silent gratitude. One last thing, Diane added, her tone shifting. The FBI has located one of Eric's burner phones. It was used yesterday to make a call from Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, close enough to return if necessary, far enough to evade immediate capture. I thanked Diane and hung up, staring at the faded glow-in-the-dark stars Zoe and I had stuck to her ceiling years ago. Even as my own life imploded, small constellations of help were appearing. Elaine's evidence and spare room, Diane's legal maneuvering, Agent Vasquez's evolving perspective. The next morning, I faced one of the hardest professional challenges of my career, meeting with the parents of my young patients to explain why I needed to temporarily suspend their children's therapy. I arranged to use a meeting room at a colleague's office, dreading the conversations ahead. To my surprise, the first family to arrive, the Ramirez, whose 8-year-old son had made tremendous progress with his anxiety, brought coffee and pastries. We saw the news, Mrs. Ramirez said quietly. Miguel says you're the only one who really listens to him. We want to help. One by one, the families arrived. Instead of the anger or judgment I'd feared, they brought support. One father, an accountant, offered to help organize my financial documentation for the investigation. A mother who practiced family law volunteered to consult on Zoe's university situation. Another parent had a brother who owned rental properties and might have an affordable apartment coming available. My patients' families, people I'd helped through their children's struggles, were now creating a safety net for me. As I thanked them, fighting back tears, I realized I was entering a new world, one where I was no longer the helper, but the one being helped. It required a vulnerability I'd never had to show before, an acceptance of support I'd always been, too proud or too busy to seek. That evening, as I moved my meager belongings into Elaine's spare room, my temporary phone buzzed with a text from Agent Vasquez. Airport security and PV identified Henderson, traveling alone. Morgan not located. Yet, stay available for questions. So they'd separated. Another calculated move? Or was something unraveling in their partnership too? I added the information to our growing case file, now expanded to include Claudia's experiences and insights. As I settled into the unfamiliar, bed in Elaine's guest room, surrounded by boxes containing the salvaged fragments of my former life, I felt a strange sense of liberation beneath the fear and uncertainty. The carefully constructed identity I'd maintained, successful professional, devoted wife, organized mother, had been built partly on illusions and compromises I hadn't recognized. Now, stripped of pretense and security, I was entering a world where I would need to define myself anew, not as Eric Morgan's wife or Zoe's mother, or even as the competent psychologist, but as Julia. Just Julia, navigating a landscape I'd never expected to traverse, discovering resources within myself I hadn't known existed. The path ahead was uncertain, the challenges daunting. But for the first time since discovering those hidden bank statements, I allowed myself to consider that perhaps, just perhaps, there might be a life worth rebuilding on the other side of this devastation. 2 weeks into my stay at Elaine's apartment, we established a rhythm. Mornings were devoted to working with authorities, providing statements, identifying documents, decoding Eric's financial maneuvers. Afternoons were spent rebuilding the practical foundations of my life, securing a temporary counseling position at a community center, opening a new bank account untainted by Eric's crimes, and sorting through the legal maze of separating my identity from his. "You need to document everything," advised Parker Kim, the accountant father of one of my patients, who had become an unexpected ally. We sat at a coffee shop near the community center, spreadsheets and receipts scattered between us. Every phone, call, every letter, every expense related to this situation. The IRS will eventually want to determine your innocent spouse status, and documentation is your best protection. I'd never considered myself particularly organized in financial matters. Eric had always handled that, but necessity proved a powerful teacher. I created meticulous records, photographing everything, backing up files in multiple locations. Never again would I be vulnerable through ignorance or misplaced trust. Agent Vasquez called regularly with updates. The investigation had expanded to include 3 more victims across 2 states, women with stories disturbingly similar to mine and Claudia's. Eric Morgan, it seemed, was actually Richard Evans, who had previously been David Pearson and possibly other identities before that. "We believe he's been operating this scheme for at least 20 years, Vasquez explained during one of our calls, moving from city to city, establishing himself as a financial advisor, gaining trust, then absconding with client funds, and leaving a romantic partner to face consequences." "And Vanessa?" I asked, still struggling to reconcile the friend who had held my hand through miscarriages and celebrated Zoe's achievements with the woman who had helped dismantle my life. "We've detained her in Mexico," Vasquez replied. "She's claiming to be another victim, insisting Morgan manipulated her just as he did you. Her story doesn't align with the evidence, but she's providing information on his possible whereabouts in exchange for consideration in her case." The news that Vanessa was Attempting to position herself as a victim ignited a fresh wave of anger. I channeled it into action, spending evenings combing through years of emails and photos, identifying inconsistencies that might help authorities understand the timeline of their deception. During this intensive research, I discovered something unexpected, a pattern of communications between Eric and a man named Gerald Hoffman, dating back 3 years. Hoffman's name appeared in Claudia's journal as well, identified as someone who had helped Richard establish new banking connections before his disappearance from her life. When I shared this information with Agent Vasquez, her voice sharpened with interest. Hoffman is on our radar as a facilitator, someone who helps create new identities and financial structures for people looking to disappear. If Morgan is working with him again, then you might be able to track him through Hoffman, I finished, feeling a surge of satisfaction at having uncovered a potentially valuable lead. While authorities pursued the Hoffman connection, I focused on rebuilding my professional foundation. The community center position paid barely enough to cover basic expenses, but it allowed me to continue working with children while my private practice remained suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. My colleagues there knew nothing of my situation until a particularly difficult day when a 7-year-old girl sobbed in my office about her father's abandonment. After the session, my supervisor Lisa found me in the break room, fighting back. My own tears. That was too close to home, wasn't it? She asked gently, closing the door to give us privacy. I looked up, startled. You know, I recognized your name from the news, she acknowledged. But I also recognize good therapy when I see it. Your personal experience gives you insight, Julia. It doesn't disqualify you. That simple validation, recognition of my professional worth separate from Eric's crimes, felt like oxygen after weeks of drowning. The most challenging aspect of rebuilding remained my relationship with Zoe. After multiple appeals and documentation provided by Diane's university contact, UCLA had allowed her to retain her scholarship with provisional status, but the emotional fallout was more complex than financial arrangements. He emailed me, Zoe revealed during one of our nightly calls, her voice tight with confusion. Dad, he says everything's been misrepresented, that you're exaggerating what happened because you were jealous of his relationship with Vanessa. My heart contracted painfully. What do you think about that? I think it's bullshit, my daughter replied fiercely. I saw the news reports. I talked to Agent Vasquez, but Mom, part of me still wants to believe him. Is that crazy? After everything he did? No, sweetheart, I assured her, thinking of how I'd questioned my own sanity during those first days of discovery. He's your father. Wanting to believe the best of him isn't crazy. It's human. I'm coming home for Thanksgiving, she announced. Not to the house, obviously, but wherever you are, that's home now. Her words were both balm and burden. I needed to create some semblance of stability before her visit, something beyond Elaine's spare room. The opportunity came unexpectedly. Mr. Suarez, whose daughter I'd counseled through selective mutism 2 years earlier, owned a small garden apartment behind his family's home. The previous tenant had moved out, and he offered it to me at reduced rent, with the flexibility to pay what I could until my financial situation stabilized. You helped Sophia find her voice, he said simply when I tried to express my gratitude. Now we help you rebuild. The apartment was tiny, just a studio with a kitchenette and small bathroom, but it represented independence. Elaine helped me move my few belongings, and other supporters appeared with unexpected gifts, a gently used love seat from Lisa at the community center, dishes and kitchen essentials from the Ramirez family, a small desk from Parker Kim. Each item carried the weight of connection, tangible evidence that I wasn't as alone as Eric had intended me to be. As I arranged these modest offerings in my new space, I thought of how diligently he had worked to isolate me over the years, gradually disconnecting me from friends who might have questioned his control, positioning himself as the center of my support system. The irony was profound. In destroying that carefully constructed isolation, he had inadvertently opened the door to genuine community. People who offered help with no expectation of control. A week before Thanksgiving, Agent Vasquez called with news. We've located another property connected to Morgan, a cabin in northern Idaho registered to one of Hoffman's shell companies. Local authorities conducted a search yesterday. Was he there? I asked, heart pounding. No, but they found something. You should see. I'm texting you an address. Can you meet me there in an hour? The address led to a storage facility on the outskirts of the city. Vasquez was waiting in the office, a sealed evidence box beside her. We found this in the Idaho cabin, she explained, opening the box and carefully removing a leather-bound journal. Based on preliminary examination, it appears to be Morgan's record of his various operations. She handed me latex gloves before allowing me to examine the journal. Inside, in Eric's meticulous handwriting, were detailed notes about his various identities, the women he had targeted, and the financial schemes he had executed, clinical observations about how to identify vulnerable prospects, methods for gaining trust, techniques for isolating victims from support networks. On page after page, he had documented his predatory methodology with the precision of a scientist. And there, in the middle section, was a chapter devoted to me. Julia P. Your ideal target profile, professional credibility, but limited financial acumen, strong maternal instincts and caretaking tendencies easily redirected, history of childhood. Instability creates heightened desire for security and conflict avoidance. I read the cold assessment of my vulnerabilities, my throat tightening with each word. He had studied me like a specimen, identifying and exploiting my deepest needs and fears with calculated precision. Why show me this? I asked Vasquez, my voice barely steady. Because understanding his methodology might help you recover, she replied. And because you've earned the right to see the truth. This wasn't about love or relationship breakdown. It was predation, pure and simple. As painful as the journal was to read, it provided something essential. External validation that I hadn't merely been a fool in love, but the target of a sophisticated predator who had perfected his techniques across multiple victims. The knowledge didn't erase the shame entirely, but it reframed it in a context that made recovery seem possible. That evening, I added a new page to my own documentation journal. At the top, I wrote, Resources for rebuilding. Below it, I listed not just material assets, but the human connections that were helping me navigate this crisis. Elaine's evidence and mentorship, Diane's legal advocacy, the Suarez family's generosity, Parker's financial guidance, Lisa's professional support, and most importantly, Zoe's unwavering love. Eric had attempted to leave me resourceless, financially, emotionally, professionally. In doing so, he had inadvertently revealed resources within myself and my community that I might never have discovered otherwise. As I prepared my tiny apartment for Zoe's Thanksgiving visit, arranging borrowed furniture and secondhand dishes, with care, I recognized that while I was still far from whole, I was gathering the pieces needed to build something new, something that would be genuinely mine in a way my previous life had never truly been. The Sunday before Thanksgiving, I stood in my tiny kitchenette attempting to make pumpkin muffins from a mix, a pathetic replacement for the elaborate holiday baking I normally did, but the best I could manage with limited resources. Zoe would arrive in 3 days, and I was determined to create some semblance of normalcy for her visit, despite my circumstances. A knock at the door interrupted my culinary struggles. Expecting Elaine, who had promised to help me prepare for Zoe's arrival, I was surprised to find Agent Vasquez on my doorstep, along with a man I didn't recognize. Julia, this is Special Agent Dominic Reyes from our Financial Crimes Division, she introduced. May we come in? I gestured them inside, suddenly self-conscious about the modest studio apartment with its mismatched furnishings. such a contrast to the elegant home where they had first interviewed me. "We have developments," Vasquez said, getting straight to the point. "Significant ones." Agent Reyes opened his laptop on my small coffee table. "Mrs. Morgan, we've been building a comprehensive case against your husband based on the evidence you and others have provided. In the process, we've uncovered what appears to be a much larger operation than we initially suspected." He turned the screen toward me, displaying a complex diagram of entities and connections. At the center was Gerald Hoffman, with spokes connecting to at least 7 different identities, including Richard Evans, David Pearson, and Eric Morgan. "We now believe your husband is part of a sophisticated network specializing in identity manipulation and financial fraud," Reyes explained. "The journal found in Idaho contains methodologies consistent with a trained approach, not an individual operating alone." Vasquez leaned forward. "Julia, the techniques documented in that journal, the targeting criteria, isolation strategies, exit protocols, they're too systematic to be self-taught. We think Eric was recruited and trained, possibly after he himself was targeted in some way." The implications staggered me. Eric wasn't just a con man. He was part of an organization. The man I had loved, built a life with, raised a child with, had been operating within a structured criminal enterprise the entire time. "Are you saying someone taught him how to target women like me?" My voice sounded distant to my own ears. "Exactly," Reyes nodded. "And we have reason to believe Vanessa Henderson was recruited into the same operation. Through Eric," I realized aloud, pieces suddenly connecting. "That's why she was so interested in our finances, in his clients. He was training her." "Believe so?" Vasquez confirmed. "Ms. Henderson has become considerably more cooperative since we presented her with evidence of the larger network. She's claiming she was coerced, that Morgan threatened her when she wanted to back out. The image of Vanessa, who had been both bridesmaid at my wedding and architect of my destruction, recasting herself as a victim sparked a flare of anger. Yet beneath the anger, a more unsettling question emerged. If Eric was recruited and trained, I said slowly, then who was he before all this began? Was anything about him real? The agents exchanged glances. "That's where we need your help," Reyes said. "We have a photograph we'd like you to examine. It's from 22 years ago, before any of his known identities were established." He produced a slightly blurred surveillance image showing a group of young people outside what appeared to be a university building. Reyes pointed to a young man on the edge of the group, thinner, with longer hair, but unmistakably Eric. "This was taken at a financial seminar at Northwestern University in 2003, Reyes explained. "We believe this is your husband before he adopted his first known false identity. The records list him as Michael Winters, a graduate student in economics." I stared at the image, transfixed by this glimpse of Eric before he became Eric, before he targeted Claudia, before me, before the orchestrated deceptions. He looked younger, of course, but there was something else different in his expression, a vulnerability absent from the man I had known. "We've located records suggesting Michael Winters was himself the victim of a sophisticated investment scam that year," Vasquez continued. "He lost his family's entire savings in what appears to have been his first encounter with the network he later joined. The narrative they were constructing hit me with unexpected force. Eric, or Michael, had once been a victim himself, later transformed into a perpetrator. It didn't excuse his actions, but it complicated my understanding of the man I had married. We believe your testimony, combined with the journal and Vanessa Henderson's cooperation, could help us dismantle this entire network," Reyes said. "But it would require you to take a more active role in the investigation." "What exactly would that involve?" I asked cautiously. "Formal detailed testimony about patterns of behavior, financial manipulations, and psychological tactics. Review of additional evidence as we uncover it. Potentially trial testimony against both Morgan and higher-level operators like Hoffman. And in return?" I wasn't being mercenary, merely practical. I had a life to rebuild, a daughter to support. We can expedite the process of separating your financial identity from Morgan's crimes, Vasquez replied. Ensure that documentation of your victim status is properly filed with credit bureaus and financial institutions. And there's a victims' compensation fund for cases like this that could provide some immediate relief. I looked around my tiny apartment with its borrowed furniture and secondhand dishes, at the half-mixed pumpkin muffins on the counter, at the photograph of Eric before he became the man who had systematically destroyed my life. I'll help, I said firmly, not just for myself, but for everyone else they've targeted or will target in the future. After the agents left, I sat alone in the growing darkness, turning over this new information. The man I married had been a construct, a carefully crafted identity built on calculated deception. Yet before that, he had been someone else entirely. Michael Winters, economics student, someone's son, someone who had been victimized himself before choosing to become a predator. That understanding, that Eric had once been Michael, that he had made a deliberate choice to harm others rather than heal from his own wounds, crystallized something vital within me. I had been asking myself for weeks what I had done wrong, how I had failed to see the truth behind the man I married. Now I recognized the fundamental error in that thinking. Eric's deception wasn't my failure. It was his choice. A choice made long before he met me, rooted in damage I had nothing to do with. The shame I had been carrying didn't belong to me at all. I called Zoe that evening, needing to hear her voice after the day's revelations. The FBI visited today, I told her after we'd discussed her travel plans. They showed me a picture of Dad from before. Before everything. Before he became the person we knew. What was he like? She asked, curiosity and caution mingling in her voice. I don't know, I admitted. But I think he was damaged, and he made terrible choices about how to handle that damage. That doesn't excuse what he did to us, Zoe said fiercely. No, it doesn't, I agreed. But understanding it helps me see that this wasn't about my failings or yours. We weren't stupid or blind. We were targeted by someone trained to exploit trust and love. The silence that followed suggested she was processing this perspective shift. Finally, she said, "So what happens now?" "I'm going to help the FBI build their case," I told her. "And I'm going to stop carrying the weight of his choices." After we hung up, I returned to the half-prepared muffin mix. As I stirred the batter, a strange lightness began to spread through me. Not happiness exactly, but a lifting of the crushing weight I'd carried since discovering Eric's betrayal. For weeks I had been struggling to understand what had happened to my life, searching for the moment when I should have seen through the deception. Now I understood there was no such moment. Eric Morgan had never existed. I hadn't failed to see the real man behind the facade. I had been deliberately presented with a constructed identity designed specifically to appeal to me. The realization was both devastating and liberating. The marriage I mourned had been with someone who never existed. The life I was struggling to rebuild wasn't a damaged version of my old existence. It was something entirely new, founded on a truth I was only now beginning to comprehend. As I poured batter into the muffin tin, a plan began forming in my mind. If I was going to testify against this network, help dismantle the operation that had destroyed so many lives, I needed to fully understand how it functioned. And to do that, I needed to speak with other victims, not just Claudia, but all of them. I reached for my journal, turning to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote Operation Phoenix, a name that acknowledged both the destruction of my old life and the possibility of something new emerging from its ashes. Below it, I began mapping out a strategy for connecting with other victims, pooling our experiences and insights to strengthen the case against the network. For the first time since discovering those hidden bank statements, I felt something beyond grief and anger, a sense of purpose. The network had tried to use me, to reduce me to a convenient scapegoat for their crimes. Instead, I would become the instrument of their exposure and downfall. As the scent of pumpkin muffins filled my tiny apartment, I recognized this moment for what it was: the turning point between victimhood and agency, between the woman who had been targeted for her vulnerabilities and the woman who would use that experience to protect others. The path ahead would be difficult and uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like my path, not one defined by Eric's deceptions or the legal system's processes, but by my own choices and determination. I'll shorten Part 9 to approximately 600 words while maintaining the key elements of building community. By Thanksgiving morning, my studio apartment had been transformed. Not into anything resembling our former home's elegance, but into something perhaps more meaningful. A space reflecting genuine care rather than calculated appearances. Elaine had brought a fold-out table and chairs. Parker, Kim's wife, sent a tablecloth and cloth napkins. Lisa from the community center contributed autumn flowers. Each item represented a connection forged in the aftermath of destruction. When Zoe arrived, her eyes widened at my new living situation. "It's just temporary," I assured her. Zoe surprised me with a fierce hug. "It doesn't matter where we are. I'm just glad you're okay." We spent the day cooking in the miniature kitchen, creating a scaled-down version of our traditional meal. As we ate, I explained that the FBI wanted me to connect with other victims to build a stronger case against the network. "Is it weird that I still think of him as Dad?" Zoe asked. "Even knowing everything he did?" "He was your father," I said gently. "Whatever else he was or wasn't, that relationship was real for you." The day after Thanksgiving, Agent Vasquez arrived with a woman approximately my age. "Julia, this is Rebecca Tanner," Vasquez introduced us. "She was involved with the man you knew as Eric Morgan when he was operating as David Pearson in Seattle." Rebecca shared her experience, a 3-year relationship that ended when David disappeared with her inheritance, leaving behind evidence suggesting she had been complicit in investment fraud. "I lost everything," she recounted without self-pity. "It took 5 years to clear my name and rebuild." She handed me a business card. "Phoenix Rising, Support for Victims of Relationship Fraud." "Phoenix," I echoed, remembering the name I'd chosen for my own project. "We have chapters in 12 cities, providing both emotional support and practical resources, legal referrals, financial counseling, identity protection services." When we attended the Phoenix Rising meeting the following week, the community center room held about 20 people from varying backgrounds. Rebecca introduced us to key members before the formal meeting began. As participants shared their experiences, I was struck by the patterns, how perpetrators identified specific vulnerabilities, isolated their targets, and created dependency while systematically extracting resources. When I spoke, I shared details I hadn't voiced before: the shame of not recognizing the deception, the disorientation of questioning 15 years of memories. "I keep asking myself what was real," I admitted. "That's the cruelest part," said an older woman named Grace. The cognitive dissonance of reconciling the person you loved with the predator they revealed themselves to be. After the main meeting, while Zoe joined the youth group, Rebecca introduced me to 3 women who had worked with law enforcement to build cases against network members. For an hour, we strategized ways to strengthen the case. Melissa's accounting expertise helped identify financial patterns. Sharon, an attorney, outlined legal approaches. Diane, a former detective, suggested investigative angles. Driving home, Zoe was animated in a way I hadn't seen since before Eric's disappearance. "The other kids in the group? They get it, Mom," she said. "They understand what it's like to have your whole identity thrown into question. And they're all doing amazing things. Advocacy work, awareness campaigns." "Did it help? Being with them?" "It helped more than anything has so far," she admitted. They don't just understand the pain, they show there's a way through it. Back at the apartment, Zoe hesitated before asking, "Would it be okay if I changed my major? Added psychology to go with film studies?" Of course. But what prompted this? Meeting those people tonight, seeing how they've turned their trauma into purpose. She straightened her shoulders. I want to understand how these predators work. Maybe film and psychology together could help create better awareness. Phoenix Rising had given us both something essential, not just support, but a framework for transforming our experience into something purposeful. We were no longer just victims, but advocates working to prevent others from suffering the same fate. December arrived with unexpected developments. The FBI's International Task Force located Gerald Hoffman in Buenos Aires, where he was taken into custody on multiple charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. His arrest triggered a cascade of revelations as investigators seized computers and documents from his residence. Hoffman is cooperating to reduce his potential sentence. Agent Vasquez informed me during our weekly update meeting. He's provided names of at least 12 operatives across the country, including details about your husband's current identity and probable location. Have they found him? I asked, my pulse quickening. Not yet, but we've narrowed it to the Pacific Northwest. He appears to be operating under the name Christopher Landers, working as a financial consultant in a small town outside Portland. The proximity was unsettling, just a few hours' drive from our city. Had he stayed close deliberately, perhaps to monitor the fallout of his deception? Or was it simply operational convenience, a calculated distance that balanced safety with accessibility? Whatever his reasons, knowing he was nearby lent new urgency to my collaboration with both the authorities and Phoenix Rising. With Rebecca's guidance, I formalized Operation Phoenix into a structured initiative within the larger organization. A task force specifically focused on documenting the network's methodology and developing protocols to help financial institutions identify warning signs. My professional background proved unexpectedly valuable in this effort. Years of observing behavior patterns in children and families gave me insights into the psychological manipulation tactics documented in Eric's journal. Working with Melissa, the forensic accountant, I created profiles of typical targeting phases, identifying the behavioral markers that might alert potential victims or their support networks. The pattern always begins with identification of vulnerability, I explained during a presentation to a group of bank security officers that Phoenix Rising had arranged. Financial need, recent loss, professional insecurity. These create openings for the initial approach. The next phase involves mirroring, presenting themselves as the perfect solution to that specific vulnerability. As I spoke, I displayed slides showing communication patterns extracted from the journal and corroborated by multiple victims' experiences. The financial professionals in the audience looked increasingly disturbed as they recognized tactics they had seen but never fully understood as part of a systematic approach. By the time they reached the isolation phase, I continued, the target has already been conditioned to trust implicitly. The predator introduces small tensions with the target's support network, subtle comments that undermine trust in friends or family, scheduling conflicts that reduce contact with potential allies. A woman in the front row raised her hand. This sounds like domestic abuse patterns. Exactly, I nodded. The methodology is remarkably similar. The difference is that these network operatives are deliberately trained in these techniques and deploy them with specific financial objectives. The strategic response we were developing operated on multiple fronts. While the FBI pursued criminal prosecutions, Phoenix Rising focused on prevention and support. Diane Levitt worked with other attorneys to modify financial regulations, requiring additional verification steps for certain high-risk transactions. Parker Kim developed educational materials for accounting professionals. Even Zoe contributed, using her winter break to create a powerful short film interviewing young adults whose parents had been either perpetrators or victims in these schemes. Her unique perspective, as both a filmmaker and someone personally affected, brought an emotional resonance to the material that dry financial warnings could never achieve. My tiny apartment became an unofficial headquarters, the borrowed table, now permanently covered with research materials, timelines, and strategy documents. The space that had initially symbolized my reduced circumstances had transformed into a command center for something much larger than my personal recovery. As Christmas approached, the Phoenix Rising community ensured no one spent the holiday isolated, a poignant counterpoint to the isolation tactics the network had employed. The Suarez family invited Zoe and me to their Christmas Eve celebration, while Elaine organized a gift exchange among those of us rebuilding our lives from scratch. These gestures of inclusion stood in stark contrast to my previous holiday seasons, with Eric, which had been carefully orchestrated to maintain the appearance of perfect family life while minimizing meaningful connections with others. The genuine warmth of these new relationships highlighted how performative our former social life had been. The week after Christmas, Agent Vasquez called with news that shifted everything once again. "We've located Eric Morgan," she said without preamble. "He's been apprehended in Cannon Beach, Oregon. Julia, they want you to identify him and potentially participate in the initial questioning. How soon can you be ready to travel?" The small observation room at the FBI field office in Nidec, Portland felt unnaturally cold, or perhaps it was just the adrenaline making me shiver. Through the one-way glass, I could see a man sitting at a metal table, his hands resting casually in front of him. He wore a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking remarkably unremarkable. Not like a fugitive financial criminal, but like someone waiting for a lunch meeting to begin. Eric. Or not Eric. Christopher Landers now, according to the file Agent Vasquez had reviewed with me on the drive from the airport. 15 years of my life had been entangled with this man, and now I was studying him like a specimen, searching his familiar features for signs of the stranger he had always been. "Take your time," Vasquez said quietly beside me. "We need absolute confirmation before proceeding." But there was no doubt. Despite the different hairstyle and subtle changes to his appearance, tinted contacts changing his blue eyes to brown, a neatly trimmed beard he'd never worn during our marriage, I would know him anywhere. The way he held his shoulders, the slight tilt of his head as he studied the room, the controlled patience in his posture that I had once admired as composure, but now recognized as the practiced stillness of a predator. "That's him," I confirmed, my voice steadier than expected. "That's the man I knew as Eric Morgan." Vasquez nodded to the technician, who made a note in the file. "You don't have to stay for the interview. We can arrange for transport back to your hotel." "No," I said firmly. "I want to hear what he says. I need to." The lead interrogator entered the room, introducing himself as Special Agent Brennan. My husband, the man I had once believed was my husband, showed no reaction beyond polite attention. "Mr. Landers," Brennan began, "or would you prefer Mr. Morgan? Or perhaps Mr. Pearson? Mr. Evans? Or should we go back to the beginning with Mr. Winters?" The slight widening of Eric's eyes was the only indication of surprise. He recovered quickly, his expression returning to neutral curiosity. "I'm afraid you have me confused with someone else," he replied, his voice so familiar it sent a physical jolt through me. "My name is Christopher Landers. I've lived in Cannon Beach for 8 months. Before that, I was in Seattle for 3 years. "And before Seattle?" Brennan pressed, opening a folder and spreading photographs across the table, surveillance images, tracking the evolution of identities from Michael Winters to Christopher Landers, with Eric Morgan prominently in the middle. Eric studied the images without visible concern. "I don't know what to tell you. This is clearly some kind of mistake or identity theft situation." "Identity theft," Brennan repeated with calculated amusement. "That's an interesting choice of words, considering the circumstances." Eric maintained his composed facade, but I noticed the slight tension in his jaw. A tell I had seen countless times during our marriage when he felt cornered but was determined not to show it. We have quite an extensive file on you, Brennan continued, producing more documents. Financial records, property transactions, witness statements, and most interesting of all, he paused for effect, your training journal. Very thorough documentation of your methodologies. At the mention of the journal, Eric's composure wavered visibly. His fingers twitched on the table, a micro-expression of alarm flashing across his features before he regained control. I'd like to speak with my attorney, he said, voice still steady but lacking its earlier confidence. Certainly, Brennan agreed. But first there's someone who'd like to speak with you. He glanced toward the one-way glass and my heart nearly stopped. This wasn't part of the plan Vasquez had outlined. I turned to her in alarm, but she was already opening the door to the observation room. Your choice, she said quietly. We didn't plan this, but Brennan thinks seeing you might break his composure. You don't have to do it. In that moment, I realized I had been preparing for this confrontation since the day I found those hidden bank statements. Every recording I'd made, every piece of evidence I'd gathered, every survivor story I'd heard through Phoenix Rising, all of it had been leading to this opportunity to face the man who had systematically dismantled my life. I'll do it, I said, stepping past her into the hallway. When I walked into the interrogation room, Eric's careful mask slipped completely. Shock, calculation, and something that might have been genuine regret crossed his features in rapid succession. Julia, he said softly, recovering enough to inject warmth into his voice. The same tone he had used when telling me he loved me, when celebrating Zoe's achievements, when promising we would grow old together. I can explain everything. I sat down across from him, folding my hands on the table to stop their trembling. Not from fear, but from the sheer surreality of the moment. Facing the stranger I had shared my life with, who now looked at me with the calculating assessment of a chess player evaluating his remaining moves. There's nothing to explain, I replied, my voice remarkably calm. I know exactly who and what you are, Michael. The use of his original name visibly rattled him. Eric, Michael, straightened in his chair, abandoning the pretense of confusion. How did you find that name? He asked, professional curiosity momentarily overriding caution. The network is unraveling, Michael. Hoffman was arrested in Buenos Aires. He's cooperating. His eyes darkened, calculating new odds. What do you want? Julia? Nothing from you, I replied honestly. You have nothing I need anymore. I never meant for you to be implicated, he offered, testing a new approach. That wasn't the plan. Things escalated when the client started asking questions. So you left me to face federal charges while you ran off with my best friend and our life savings, I stated flatly. How considerate. He leaned forward, dropping his voice intimately. You don't understand how this works. Once you're in the network, there's no walking away. I did what I had to do. You had choices, I countered. Every step of the way. You chose to turn from victim to predator. You chose to target women like Claudia, like me. You chose to involve Zoe in your deceptions. At our daughter's name, genuine emotion briefly crossed his face. How is she, finding her way forward? Without you. Agent Brennan, who had been observing silently, placed another document on the table. Mrs. Morgan has been instrumental in helping us understand the network's psychological manipulation tactics. Her insights have already helped identify 3 more operatives. Michael's eyes met mine, reassessing me entirely. I was no longer the trusting target he had selected for manipulation, but an adversary who had dismantled his carefully constructed world. The journal was never meant to be found, he said finally, a professional acknowledging a tactical error. Yet, here we are, I replied, standing to leave. Goodbye, Michael. I won't be visiting you in prison. As I walked out, his voice followed me. Julia, wait. I didn't turn back. The The confrontation I had dreaded for months hadn't given me the closure I expected. Instead, it had confirmed what I already knew. The man I loved had never existed, and the man who did exist was no longer my problem. 1 year later, I stood at a podium addressing the annual conference of the National Association of Financial Crime Victims. The audience of survivors, law enforcement professionals, and financial industry representatives filled the hotel ballroom. The network that targeted so many of us has been largely dismantled, I explained, gesturing to the organizational chart projected behind me. 17 operatives are now serving sentences. 3 more await trial. Most importantly, financial. Institutions have implemented new protocols based on our research, preventing an estimated $50 million in similar frauds this year alone. From my vantage point, I could see familiar faces in the crowd. Elaine sat with Parker Kim, both now serving on Phoenix Rising's advisory board. Claudia had flown in from Chicago, where she led a support group for fraud survivors. Agent Vasquez attended in a non-official capacity, having become both ally and friend during the investigation. In the front row, Zoe beamed with pride. Now a junior in college, she had produced a documentary about financial predators that had won a student Emmy and was being used in training programs nationwide. Her dual major in film and psychology was opening doors neither of us had imagined. Our experiences were designed to isolate and destroy us, I continued. Instead, they connected us, forming a community stronger than the network that targeted us. What was meant to be our greatest vulnerability has become our greatest strength. After the presentation, as attendees mingled during the reception, I circulated through the room, now comfortable in my role as advocate and expert. My private practice had reopened 6 months earlier, with a new focus on trauma recovery for fraud victims. The tiny studio apartment had been replaced by a modest but comfortable condo that Zoe and I had selected together. "Dr. Wilson," called a voice behind me. I had reclaimed my maiden name last spring. I turned to find Rebecca approaching with a couple I didn't recognize. "These are the Hansons. Their situation mirrors yours in several ways. I thought you might have insights for them." As I welcomed the anxious-looking couple, I recognized in their expressions the same confusion and shame I had once felt. But I also recognized their courage in seeking help, in refusing to let someone else's betrayal define them. "The path forward isn't easy," I told them honestly, "but you don't have to walk it alone. And I promise you, what awaits on the other side is worth the journey." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.